And let's talk a little bit about the emotional aspect of it as well, because just from you talking about this experience and what you have to do, it sounds extremely intensive, and I'm already tired
Yeah.
just thinking about it. So, what is that part like?
The emotional aspect of being an interpreter really does depend on the setting. In my particular experience, working at that children's hospital was, for the most part, pretty intensive cases, because like I mentioned, they're one of the best hospitals on this side of the states, that offers services to children and children with pretty severe cases. And so it was unique just in the setting itself, but in the conversations as well. When I worked in the general hospital and was assigned to the labor and delivery, generally speaking, it's always good. It's always good news. There were occasions where it was not, but they were very far few in between. Whereas to the children's hospital, you could have at least one really severe case every day that you worked. It does take a toll emotionally. As a trained interpreter, you are trained to separate yourself from the situation. But I think that my counterparts, colleagues could say that there's only so much you can separate or try to separate from the situation until it basically, you know, affects you. There is such a thing as, the trauma that occurs to the interpreter as a result of all the information that they're absorbing. So, a technique that is utilized in interpreting is the first person conversation. And so when we speak in first person, we are absorbing the communication as if it were our own. So say, for instance, you say, I'm not feeling well and I've been feeling like this for 3 days. The interpreter will say, I'm not feeling well and I've been feeling like this for 3 days. The interpreter, the trained interpreter, does not say, Joshua says that he's been feeling sick and that he's not been feeling well for 3 days. So we internalize that in the sense of, we're claiming it as if it were our own, because your voice is my voice is your voice as the patient. And so, imagine day in and day out of that. It does cause, I'm not going to say it can, it does cause trauma if the interpreter doesn't know how to basically do things to support them mentally and physically and separate them from the experience. We're very much involved, and you do tend to internalize it because of the I factor, right? And so, well, there's no science behind that, but I mean, if we think about it, right, there's plenty of research done with how situations like this affects the interpreter. And I'm trying to think of the actual phrase that's called, I don't know why I can't think of it right now, but there's an actual term for it, which basically in essence means it's trauma that is caused to the interpreter as a result of, the difficult encounters, and not releasing that, not having a way to go and release that somehow.
Wow. And then, do you know if there's any stories of interpreters who have endured this trauma and then they've actually had to stop being an interpreter because they weren't able to handle it or they didn't know how to deal with it?
Yes, I've actually have had guests on the show that do speak about the fact that they didn't realize how it was affecting them, and how the stories were affecting them. And so they worked and worked and worked until one day that one case kind of took them over. Like it basically was the last straw, right? In terms of having like an anxiety attack, or just it manifested physically only because there was so much information that had been taken down or absorbed by the interpreter that ultimately ended up affecting them. There's one story in particular where he speaks about being an over the phone interpreter, and there were a lot of stories that would come through, or a lot of cases that would come through over the phone, but one in particular that was very impactful because it had to do with domestic violence and suicide. And so he absorbed that, but it shocked him because of what happened. It was a 911 call that he was interpreting for. And so, from the beginning to the end, and then it was like he was done with the call, but it left him in this shock mode, and he didn't do anything about it. And so as the days went by and he kept getting cases, it's almost like the aftermath really of, a collection of trauma stories, all this negativity. And at some point he just cracked, and he, was manifesting in a way that he didn't want to go to work anymore. He had anxiety getting a phone call such as that again, right? Like it would manifest, and he'd get anxious. All of that his body was doing on its own without him thinking about it. And it turns out that it was because he was having, this, I don't know why I can't think of the word, but, he was having this trauma that was affecting him as a result of his past experiences, because there was no one he was speaking with about them so that he could let them go, or doing anything for himself so that he could release that tension and that anxiety. So, I mean, it can definitely affect the individual. We're there interpreting, but yet we are part of the experience in a way.
Yeah, there's a lot more to it than just trying to interpret from one language to another. It seems like
it's not just speaking, that's for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of emotional connection to it, and there can be. I think that for the most part, many language professionals begin their careers in this profession because it's a way of giving back to the community, because we want to help. And so we do things with that, with the heart really leading. And then you get involved in situations like this. And one of the first things that you're taught is that as an interpreter, you've got to abide by your role boundaries and the professionalism, and you can't get involved as you would a bilingual individual and say, hey, let me advocate for you. No, don't do that, or no, don't say that, or how about you should ask this question. You can't do that as a trained interpreter. So you kind of get left with that feeling of like, oh, I wish they would say this, or I wish they would say that, and that you're left with that. So it's a challenge, most definitely, to say the least. Mm-hmm.